Um, we're having a conversation today with Professor Sammy Britt, who was a lifelong student of Henry Hensche and has taught students himself for over the last 50 years. We're in his studio in the Mississippi Delta. Sammy, how did you learn about Henry and end up studying with him?
Well, I was attending the Memphis Academy of Arts in Memphis, which is now called the Memphis College of Art. But I met Charlie Miller, my friend, and several others of us that were in drawing and painting classes. And at the end of my freshman year, Linda and I got married, and we were living in an apartment in Memphis. But in the end of my but during my sophomore year, Nelson Shanks, who had come to Memphis to do some portrait commissions, was asked to teach a couple of courses at the Art Academy by Ted Rush, the director at that time. And he began teaching drawing and portrait painting. And he kind of got interested in Charlie Miller, Howard McKenzie, and myself, Fred Wagner, and Jerry Finberg. We all were kind of interested in the realism concept of art at that time. We didn't know too much about color or the color concept. We had all had art history, and the 4 years that I studied it at the Art Academy, and part of my job was to show slides for all the art history classes, including my own. So I had a pretty good pounding of art history in all periods of time. But Nelson, I didn't take a class under him at first, and then Charlie was talking about how much he was doing, and then so the next semester I took a class under him, and I really, and he also on his own, not getting paid, had a drawing class, figure drawing class at night that he came and draw, and the 5 of us would come and draw and talk about art. And he started talking about Henry Hensche, this guy that, painted like Monet, a colorist up in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And, he kept talking about him, and they became very interested, particularly Charlie and Howard and a couple others. And they were talking about going to study with him which was the summer of '63. And I would go, and during that time, he talked to us about the knife, painting knife and board. Well, Charlie and some of us would go out to the park. We were in Overton Park because that's where the Art Academy, and we'd be trying to paint a landscape or something, We didn't paint the blocks at that time. We were just trying to paint, and you can imagine how bad they were. But and I would go home and talk to Linda like she worked, and had a child. Allison was a little baby, and at dinner at night I kept talking about this man Henry Hensche, and this, with no intention of going, because we didn't have nothing, we didn't have money. But anyway, after a few weeks of that, Linda said, "Well, why don't you go?" And I said, "Well, if your parents don't kill me, mine will." So I didn't literally say that, but it would have been but anyway, she encouraged me to go, and she's the main reason I went, and I want to give her credit for that. And I went, and it turned out to be the best vocational thing in my life. And we all rode up in Charlie Miller's, I think it was a Chevrolet Impala, I don't know what year it was, but his dad was a used car salesman or something like that. And on the way up, it was an interesting trip because we went to every major museum that was on the way, and we actually went out of the way to go to some of them. So we were funny. We were looking out the windows and looking in thinking we were seeing all this color and stuff. And then we finally made it to, our last stop was the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And that was wonderful experience. All the museums were wonderful experiences. Then we headed down to Provincetown, and I think we got there we were going to get there too early, so we slept on park benches, one of the parks on the way down, and sleeping bags. We all had sleeping bags. And we finally got to Provincetown, and it seemed like it was early in the morning that we went by, knocked on Henry's door, and he greeted us and came in, and Ada gave us tea. One thing I'd like to say about Nelson Shanks back at the Art Academy, he introduced us to a lot of people that had, like the Dixons, that now is a museum, and the Mara Mosses, the people like that. And we got to actually go to their homes and look at their collection. And that was the first time I'd had tea and crumpets. But getting back to Provincetown, and we got there early. Henry, the school didn't start till right around July the 4th or 1st of July. But we got out of classes in Memphis in May, so we were there in June, and we rented an old shanty. This is what we call them down south, and actually it was pretty bad. But 5 of us rented this shanty, and it had no furniture or anything, so we went to the city dump, and we got orange crates to put up, you know, and we got some.
Was this over at Nathan's by the cemetery?
Yeah. And it was the one right by the cemetery. And we got other things we ended up with doors to put our sleeping bags on and stuff. I really had very little furniture. But Henry would come by in the morning and in the afternoon and actually teach us before, you know, school ever started. We were painting blocks then, and it was really the first real experience of seeing and being exposed the relationship of one color spot to the other according to the light, what we now call light key, and which has nothing to do with plein air. But the thing is I think he loved to teach, and he would come and work, talk to each one of them, and then he would just, you know, he would talk. Henry liked to talk about the history. And all the years that I ever went up there, he talked about the history of art, and he talked about painting, and when the real innovations in painting began and started. And if I get sidetracked, let me know. But we spent the summer, once school started, we went over to school and painted with blocks and still life, pots and pans on the hedge, with the hedges, and then the sand box in the back, in that part of the school. We would literally work all day long, and all the years I ever went up there, I would pretty much work from sunrise to sunset. I would kind of take a nap or get something at noon to eat, and so his teaching and his understanding of the art history and how innovations or movements graduated over the years and up until Impressionism. Now, I don't know how much you want me to go into that, but that's a whole nother thing. But when we first started doing the blocks, we did not draw. He would not let us draw. And he didn't let us draw from. We'd use color spots, color shapes, color masses, and later on, okay, he said, okay, I want you to, and we did this with the round objects. We didn't draw. But later he said, okay, for placement purposes, for composition, I want you to do, and we did what we call, it can be called analytical drawing, construction drawing, or geometrical. But in other words, you're using lines and then you break it in a few planes. Not too many, just the light, half light, shadow, cast shadow, and so forth. So that was the only draw that we did. The whole time I was ever up until the last summer of 1988, which reminds me, that summer we were working on landscapes, and I'd done a landscape and pretty much finished it, and it's wasn't so much wrong with it, but I think while I was launched, they were all looking at it, and Henry was over there, and I think the point is, he said I had too many variations in it. And he said, you know, the painting it works, but it's too many. He said, okay, I want you to show, and none of them. This is one of those things that kind of got lost as Henry got older in the teaching, the geometrical concept of breaking things down into planes, not only with the construction of the line, but with the color shapes. So he asked me to do that, so I started another board. That's it right up there, the top, the finished product. But I drew it and broke it into planes like that, and he wanted people to, then I just began to paint like what he was talking about. But one thing I want to say about that, if you've been studying quite a while and you understand the principle of the color relationships and the geometrical, you know, analysis, the only reason for the main reason and the most important reason for the geometrical, or the breaking things down into planes and angles, is it teaches you to think three-dimensional. If you don't have a sculpture background, then you won't understand three-dimensional painting. And that's the important part. And that's the reason for his emphasizing that at that period of time, of which I was from the time I was 23 years old, and really painted with him until the last couple of years before he died.
And to me, that's one of the most important things that Henry did to people that he really knew could succeed with what they were doing, is he would continuously put us back in elementary school.
Well, I would like to say this, and he used this analogy. Painting this way, it's like a language. You have to start with the fundamental. You have to start with ABC. The blocks are the ABC. And I'd also like to clear up something that was on the hensche site somewhere about when the blocks started. Actually, there wasn't Henry's idea or Ada's. They were a guy from Philadelphia, and he told me the name one summer, and I forgot.
Yeah, in the 1950s.
Yeah, and it started with bricks painted, and then the block. But regardless of that, that's insignificant. The point is, if you put 3 blocks in front of people, and you put them on a table on a sunny morning, and not trying to be fancy with your composition, separate them, and no drawing, and you put down the color spot that represents the shadow plane, and the middle plane, and the light plane. I never use the term value or tone. And if you're speaking English, you use English terms. If you're painting, color painting, you use terms that apply to color painting. Don't intermix tonal painting with, and that's what I think confuses a lot of people. A lot of preconceived knowledge is a dangerous thing. It interferes with the true learning process of visual perception. To me, I don't want to get too far off of the teach, but that Henry's teaching was really very simple. And it goes back to Hawthorne, the one delicious note against the other. When you stop to think about it, that's what it is. And the thing about, and Henry perfected the concept of teaching this principle. And he did it through a disciplined process of learning this first, learning, going through the stage. Once you understand a language, you can express yourself in any way you want to. But the problem is most people are not willing to learn the fundamentals to equip themselves to express themselves for the rest of their life, to continue learning. Every time I tell my students when I was at the state in late years in workshop, when I stand in front of a still life, or whether it's a block or a landscape, I mentally say that I've never seen this before, because I haven't. It's never. You have to think like you cannot presume you know how to paint something. You have to figure it out, and you can. People talk about limited palette, well, that's like a concert pianist going out and he knows the scales, he's done everything, but you limit yourself to 3 keys. You can make a noise, but for an hour and a half, that would be pretty boring. Well, to me, a limited palette limits your. Nature's limitless. Light, you cannot limit it. Everything that we understand about painting it from a color visuals or color perception or a visual truth deals with light. Light is the first element. Color is the second, and shape. Light defines the color, reveals the color. The color defines the shape, and they're all within what? The kind of light. The light, like it's sunny morning, it's a gray morning, it's fall, it's winter, it's summer, it's whatever. And this has nothing to do with plein air painting. And I'm not against that, but I think it's like a lot of things that become fads. It gets away from the true purpose of why you're a painter.
Well, Sammy, the quick sketch has become
Painting.
supposedly the highest level, when actually it's the beginner's level.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is, painting is not a game. Painting is not a fad. Painting is a gift to begin with, and it's intended to be used not to amuse yourself. It's intended to enhance and to edify and to enlighten and to educate people into the art of seeing. And I can't put it any plainer than that. And I think that you need a break. Don't get me going, man.
Sammy, if you would, talk about the development of a study, the development of the color in the study from the early spots on up through the minor variations, and at the end of that, talk about the difference between the generalized broken color that we see people using everywhere and what Henry referred to as broken color, which is minor variations.
Well, then, even from the very beginning, with even the block studies and the round objects, and later on the landscapes, even for head studies or heads or whatever you want to call them, it was the large masses, the big color notes, according to the light key, that were the most important. And sometimes you're not ever going to hit those notes as well as you could the first time, so you restate. There's a danger of restating them too many times or not understanding how those notes relate to one another. And I'm going to just go on with one of the biggest problems that beginners have, and even advanced painters, when they start a painting, they go too quickly to one area and they start working that area without moving the eye around and restating all the messes with the same relationship of the way they see it. Now, when you get into the modeling, like let's say we were modeling a still life, a powder, or a ceramic piece, or a bottle of something, you state it just like you do the blocks. You have a light plane, called a shadow plane, and a middle plane. Now, I don't refer to values in any form or fashion. All of these plane changes. Henry always said a plane change is a color change. That's a very simple way of remembering that it's not a value, it's a color change. And once you understand, once you get the larger masses, then what we call the next largest variations, in other words, the ones that, then you state those, and those should be stated with as much clarity as the first statements. Let's just say there's a shadow note and there's a reflection in the shadow note. Well, if that note is kind of a minor note, you'd ignore it at that point until you get into development. But as you develop that still life or that landscape or whatever it is, you become more involved with more variations. And more variations is not necessarily a finished product, but it's in the studying. At one point, I remember Henry was talking about and said, you want to get to the point that you understand very much, that you develop everything. You put too many, it's overdeveloped, and that way you know that you've gone too far. A lot of the misinterpretations of the way he taught was because there wasn't a consistency in the years, over the years. He never really altered his teaching. I think as he got older, he lost stamina and he also lost vision. So, and that is understandable. So that probably is the reason for some of the misunderstanding in the latter years of his teaching and when he was in Provincetown. But get back into the model problem. It's if you started this painting and if you started this study on a sunny morning, and you get the consistency of days, and you keep working on it and stuff. Well, you develop it as far as you can. And what makes a painting finished? It's when you exhaust your knowledge to carry it any further. In other words, it's not necessarily a finished painting in the painting sense. You have finished what you know about it, so you start another one. This is a part of his teaching, and it was a part of my teaching. You understand that each time you start a painting, you develop a painting or develop a study, however you want to call it, it's your understanding, your analysis of how well you see, how well you understand what's in front of it. Not preconceptions, not what you did yesterday, but what you see at that point, that moment, in that period of time, and truly study what's in front of you. You're going to make progress. You're going to get better. You're going to develop an understanding of how to hold this light key. A beginner gets to the point he can distinguish between a sunny morning and a cloudy morning or something like that. But you get to a point where your understanding is you see not only the difference between a sunny morning, but a mid-morning and mid-afternoon, and all these things, but you also can do that indoors with natural light. You should be able to paint, develop a still life in natural light, say north light, like I have in my studio, how the same still life is different in mid-afternoon. Well, Henry was actually the first painter to ever paint a still life indoors at the same still life in the morning at different times of the day.
And Sammy, wasn't it Ada? Henry was working on an indoor still life in their home, and he kept working on it even though the sun was in and out, and Miss Ada says, "Henry, can't you see the key has changed?" And she was the one that pointed out to him that indoor light changed as much as outdoor light.
It does, and I think probably the studios are different, but it's a strange thing about mine. A gray day actually has more light on than a sunny day. It's easier to see it. It's more contrast. I think that's peculiar to each to position of your windows and so forth. But getting back to the method of study, it's very simple. You start with the masses, then you put the larger variations and the minor variations, and it's depending on how well you see and how much you understand, how far you can take that study or that painting. And the confusion about broken color and variation is not broken color. It's simply seeing the refinement of the larger masses and what actually models and shapes that form or that still life or that composition according to that light key that was set in the beginning of your painting. If your light key is not established in the first statements, you have to restate them. The light key determines the way you develop your painting. Let's talk about drawing a little bit in painting. Drawing, in the strictest sense, I've taught drawing for years, and Henry was I've never seen anybody any better draftsman than him. But the point is, in this concept of painting, in this drawing is learning to draw with shapes, with big color shape, then variations. And I want to emphasize the importance of the beginning, your first statements. When you start, people are in a hurry, and we're all guilty of this, when they're hurrying to do something. But if you don't take the time to get the masses in proportion, nothing else is going to be in proportion. You could spend 2 hours on a drawing, but until you start looking at it in terms of color relationships, you'd be surprised how far off your drawing is. And I'm not downgrading drawing. I think it's a great thing. I've seen beautiful drawings. And I don't draw much anymore, but I used to love to draw, and I taught drawing. But we're talking about two different ways of drawing. Well, a lot of people was arguing, well, that's painting, that's not drawing. No. If you're seeing something, if you visualize something, if you're perceiving one shape in relationship to another shape, and it comes to an edge, that edge is interpreted as many years ago and traditionally as a line. Well, actually there are no lines in nature, and there are no values. There are only lights and darks. Everything else in between is either had to be seen in terms of values in the early stages, as far back as the Renaissance, and even I got a book on Della Francesca, a fresco painter. He understood the value of modeling through light and shadow, and not to the degree of Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. But drawing with color, I remember the first summer I went to Provincetown. We didn't draw at all. I did some little drawings in my sketchbook and stuff for myself personally, but for his studies we didn't. And when I came home, and I could draw better, it's seeing. The art of seeing through color relationships teaches you, not only does it teach you more about drawing, but more about three-dimensional composition, and it teaches you about design itself. And so much of even the color studies that I see today, each individual has to reach a point of once they understand the study and of color in the relationship to the light key, as they individually develop they should develop an individual way of expressing this language, and it's not the same way for everyone. For example, you and Gerald and Richard and Charlie Miller, myself, and all of us use color. We speak the same language, color relationship. But our paintings are similar in resemblance, but they're different. They're all different. And
well, Henry expected us to eventually evolve to be different, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Matter of fact, the last summer I was in Provincetown, which was 1988, we were talking, and I asked him, I said, Henry, what do I need to do? And he said, you understand this really well. You've painted and you've taught, you've practiced it. He said, you just need to become more spiritual. And he may or may not have meant in what people would call a religious term, but to me, I've always painted in the spirit. My relationship to God is my motivation. But he meant to paint with more freedom, paint with less restriction. Don't think about it so much. Don't worry so much about it. Just free yourself up and paint it. You know, it's a shame we have to wait till it's so doggone old and so doggone long to understand that principle. Not only does that principle apply to painting, but it applies to life. Everything becomes so complicated. Our mind it's not that complicated. We allow it to be. So to me, painting is enjoying it, developing, painting things like as simple as painting with a hole in the ground, you know, or a pile of dirt, or something really beautiful, or a nice landscape, or a landscape still like that. And what, you know, you're equipped to do what you wanted to do years ago, and you know, I remember one time I asked her, Henry, when am I going to get good enough to do anything? And he just rattled out a date, and he said 2000 something. And sure enough, he was right. It took me that long.
We learn all the prose, but the end of it all is supposed to be that you're supposed to be expressing poetry. That's the spiritual aspect, that what he called the essentials. Eliminate all but the very essentials of your subject. That's the hard part.
It is. And every time I start a painting, I start out with that in mind, but I go too far. And, but I think that's probably normal for everybody. I don't know what else you...
Sammy, and going back to the broken color idea, I know in a lot of Henry's landscapes there would be clusters of leaves. There would be 3 or 4 notes that were the same color as an accentuation, and over here 3 others would be a completely different color. It's like animating the form, and also that idea of modeling the light, which really gets into complicated thinking and high level of study. But what Peter and I were talking about recently is the fact, in Henry's mind, that quote broken color are minor variations that are very specific in color and shape and application because they're serving a certain purpose.
Well, sometimes broken color is interpreted different. For instance, like we were talking about with the leaves, Henry, when as he developed the painting and in the masses and everything was in the place it was been, then you put a few color notes in something like that, and you flick this and there. That's really not broken color. That's accents to the form itself, and that's the difference. For instance, Monet used a lot of broken color, and Monet is really to be complimented for the concept of being able to discern the different times of day, and he did beautiful paintings. But some of his landscapes and stuff like that they don't recede because of the broken color. And I'm not, don't misunderstand it's just an observation about his work. I've seen his originals and as well as reproductions. The thing is, the surprising thing about seeing a lot of his work in reality in the museums, and one of the painting Sunrise that's in the museum in Paris, I can't remember the name, but to see that painting in person is a lot different. It really has, it's a three-dimensional composition. It's beautiful, it really is. I was kind of taken back when I walked, where it was, you walk down there and there it is on the wall over there. It had all the depth you would ever want in a painting, and it was not broken color. But I think the problem with photographing our work and the photographing Monet's work or Hensche's or anybody's like that, it's hard to capture the actual light key. In other words, when you're painting a still life, or when you're painting a landscape or a portrait, figure, whatever it is, there's indoors, of course, there's not as much atmosphere, but there's atmosphere and there's distance between you and that object, and we try to paint the distance as well as that color is entirely different at one distance than it is. You put the same color blocks, and I did this at Del State one year. I had big blocks made, and I put them outside of the art department. I had my students paint them, and the ones they were entirely different. They were the same, but at different distances, they became less colored. You see what I mean? And all these things are part of our understanding of how we see. We don't just go out and look at something and just start painting. You take enough time to if you don't notice the light key, if you don't notice the time of day, I know I'm dwelling on this, but that's the key to it. This study is nothing without understanding that. It's just a formula.
Sammy, talk a little bit about the use of this exaggerated overcoloring, its purpose at the beginning and its purpose ongoing as we develop ourselves.
Well, when a student first starts out, Henry would have them, encourage them, and he would do demonstrations in an overcolored manner. In other words, exaggerate the color in each plane change, and sometimes he called it the savage stage or garish, but it's not intended to stay into that stage, but in each level of your development and understanding, as you get better and you understand how things are developed, you still I overcolor to this day, and so did Henry, but he overcolored according to his knowledge and understanding of what he saw, not necessarily just for the sake of overcoloring. There's a difference between the beginner in a savage stage than a person that's been painting a while, studying and understanding this, and their level of the overcoloredness. For one thing, the reason for the overcoloring was to shock the student into seeing color, to understanding what the color's always been there, and not to the garish stage. But if he can get them to look at and to put it down in an overstated way, they begin to start looking at things in terms of color and color relationships rather than just local color. You know, the average person that begins in paintings, they look at a red block and blue block and white block. They see the white block in shadow, and they see it as, they see white, and then you add something black to it or something, you make it darker, and then another, you know, less white, you make it middle plane. But that's local color. Same thing with whatever, you know, it has nothing to do with understanding the relationship of color according to the plane changes. And the overcoloring is very important in the beginning stage. It's important, period. In whatever your subject matter has nothing to do with subject matter. Somebody says, well, how do you paint a portrait? How do you paint a landscape? How do you paint a still life? You paint them the same way. They're different subjects in different lighting conditions, in different circumstances. And another thing we haven't mentioned is the environment in which the thing is seen. You put 3 blocks on a table, they're a limited environment. They have the grass or a hedge behind them. They have a tablecloth, and you know, those are relationships thing. You paint a landscape, you got a whole other thing. You paint a portrait, you got something else. But all of this, the environment is as important part of the color relation, because the environment in which it's seen is a color. It's a color relationship. It's a note of color that relates to what you're painting, whether it's a still life, a portrait, or figure, or landscape. And this, I don't think you could. The thing is Henry. If Henry were living today, he would say that he hasn't scratched the surface of this understanding of color relation, this concept of color, and how it's so different from the traditional. I don't think history, and I don't know in my lifetime it will, and it certainly didn't in Henry's, that will recognize this as actually a different understanding, a different movement of realism. In other words, what we call the visual truth. To me, visual truth means, there are a lot of meanings of truth, but visual truth is seeing the light key and understanding that light key, and seeing that color in that light key, and seeing that shape in light key, and putting those 3 elements together to create the illusion of reality is the visual truth. Any questions?
Yeah, when we're talking about, Henry said if you'd been studying all summer and your eye was up and you were conditioned to it, that try starting a landscape or a still life with the minor variations and see if you could see all of those, juggle that many different things in the light key. And if you couldn't, of course, push them back to masses, but
Yeah.
there was a reason for that.
Well, in relationship to that, I remember one summer I was up there, and Henry wanted me and Charlie to see a painting he was working on. And we went over to where he was painting in his backyard. And he said, I started this painting with variations. And he said, you can do that if you understand what you're seeing. In other words, if you've been painting and your eye and your mind is conditioned, it's like you can go to that note more accurately and more quickly. It's a beginner can't do it. Even an advanced painter cannot do it if he's not been painting on a regular period of time. I think Henry enjoyed painting so much that he tried a lot of different things that he was perfectly capable of doing, not only because of his color skill, but also of his drawing skill. In other words, I don't mean, his drawing skill was developed before his color skill because of the way he was trained. And he would do the charcoal drawings at night of students, you know, to keep up his proportions. And he said that, but he just really wanted to talk to you all night long. But he did that otherwise too. You know, have two really nice drawings, three that he did. Two of me and one of Linda this summer. She went up there. But I think that history will have to take a good look at what he actually accomplished and what he was capable of attaining in his lifetime, from the time that he actually started studying with Hawthorne and began teaching, and the students he'd had over the years. The thing about most really good ideas, people, for various reasons, they don't stick with it, and some of them are legitimate. But a lot of times it's too hard. It's hard work, and they don't have the faith or the courage to continue doing it, and that's a shame, because I've seen so many talented people over the years in Provincetown and through my teaching. They were very talented, much more so than I would have ever been. But you've got to be willing to work. And the work is the part of, you know, willing to see, willing to work, willing to open your mind, and really to get rid of your preconceptions.
Well, Sammy, that leads to this point. There are so few practicing painters left that understand the full range of what Henry taught, and of those people, not many of them teach. And even those that have taught, the work ethic of students these days is just not like it was when we were coming up. Does what Henry taught survive the end of his first generation students?
I think it does, for this reason. I don't think, and this is my faith, I don't think God lets good ideas die. And the thing is, there never has been many, you know, for a lot of different movements that truly pursued it. You take Impressionism, for instance. There was just a handful of men, a handful of guys at the Barbizon School of Painting, Millet and Corot and Daubigny, all of those guys. Constable and Turn. It's two English painters that pursued the understanding of landscape and out in the light. You know, it's never been a lot. You know, Christ started with 12. So, you got any more questions?
No, I think that'll get it.